Okay, the final talk before the break will be given by Julia Y. from Harvard University. Julia is studying condensed matter physics and quantum information. Her advisor is Norman Yao, and she's done a practicum at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Let's welcome Julia.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for making it to the final talk of the session. I'll be talking about simulating the dynamics of quantum phase transitions. So the subfield of physics that I'm in is called Atomic, Molecular, and Optical Physics, or AMO. And I was drawn into this field in undergrad doing experimental research in an AMO lab, seen here, where the day-to-day is a lot like Lego building, but with lasers. And the apparatus shown here is the starting step in many of these experiments, where a combination of lasers and magnetic coils are used to trap a cloud of atoms and cool them down to very low temperatures. On the microkelvin scale. There have been many advances in quantum experiments within AMO, and a key advance is single atom rearrangement, where the main technology is optical tweezers, where an optical tweezer is a focused laser beam that can be used to trap individual atoms. When you have hundreds of these tweezers in the many complicated, far more than I worked on in undergrad, but these complicated experiments with hundreds of optical tweezers can be used to rearrange atoms dynamically into geometries seen on the right, like here and here, where the fluorescence of these balls of light come from single atoms. And using these atom arrays, we're able to study different quantum dynamics as well as entangled phases of matter. And this motivates being able to develop better classical simulations in order to understand and interpret these experiments. The main challenge in classical simulations of quantum dynamics is the entanglement barrier. To understand this, we can first consider the 2-qubit case, where the canonical example of entanglement is a Bell pair. Seen here. It's the superposition of spin up and spin down. And if you measure a spin up on one qubit, no matter how far away the second qubit is, you will also always measure a spin up. So that's sort of the idea of entanglement. And in contrast, if we consider the X state down below, no matter what you measure on the first qubit, you can get an independent measure on the second. So it's not affected by each other due to the factorization structure of the state. However, with 2 qubits, we can always write down the state by hand. And it's not clear where this entanglement barrier actually comes in. So that's a many-body effect. It happens when we go from 2 to n qubits, where the classical memory for an arbitrary state on n qubits now scales exponentially in system size. But at the same time, it's important to come up with classical simulations and figure out ways to model in spite of this entanglement barrier. And this is used to address both sort of these fundamental questions, such as understanding the ground state on the Kagame lattice. And it can also have downstream technological implications, such as modeling the properties of few layers of graphene. So we have now arrived at various classical approaches. So for example, when the system size is small enough, you can sort of bash the problem using either direct solvers or iterative Krell methods. But for anything larger than around 25 qubits or so, we do have to use some sort of approximation. And I've organized things where the y-axis is increasing entanglement, or roughly how challenging a problem is to simulate. So we can split things up in terms of dimension, the spatial dimension, where for 1D ground states and 1D dynamics, tensor networks are the state of the art. Meanwhile, as we go toward 2-dimensional ground states or 2-dimensional dynamics, a combination of tensor networks seen here or machine learning methods tend to be widely used. So in the talk, I'll be mostly going over dynamics in 1D systems, as well as relying on tensor networks. Okay, so now that we've introduced these experiments where you can rearrange single atoms, as well as different types of classical approximation methods, we now have all of the tools that we need to study how water boils, also known as phase transitions. In particular, we're interested in quantum phase transitions, where the paradigmatic transition is shown here. This transition comes about because of the interplay between 2 different energy scales. One is the internal interaction energy between neighboring spins along some internal z-axis, where spins can minimize their energy if they align with each other. The second is this external field, this transverse field, where if that external field is strong enough, all spins will just independently align along that field. But if you tune this field strength, there is a certain point where the system undergoes a quantum phase transition. This is called like the quantum critical point, where there will be a spontaneous magnetization along the internal axis. So everything will either point all up or all down. And it might seem like this is not related to boiling water, and it turns out that it's not, it's just like a different phenomenon. However, if we go back to the water phase diagram, if we go back to the water phase diagram, we can zoom away from like the boiling point at 1 ATM, and we can go toward this box here instead. So qualitatively, it looks like this, and we might be able to point out some qualitative similarities if we can make this analogy between a transverse field strength and the pressure temperature curve. So along this pressure temperature curve, there's two phases of water, two distinct phases, liquid and vapor, in the same way that there's these two distinct orientations of the magnet. Beyond that, there's a critical point, just like there's a quantum critical point. And beyond this point, there is no distinguishing factor between liquid and vapor anymore. You get this disordered supercritical fluid, and this only occurs at very high temperatures and pressures. But it's similar to the fact that here, when the transverse field strength is just so strong that everything just sort of aligns, and there's no like interaction energy scale anymore that matters. And it turns out it's more than just this qualitative comparison. In StatMech, at least, different systems can be described by the same physical theory, near criticality, and this idea is called universality, which is one of my favorite ideas in physics. And basically, once you're near these critical points, the density fluctuations in water in this theory are analogous to the fluctuations in the magnetization in the quantum phase transition. And moreover, another crucial feature of these critical points is scale invariant behavior, just like a fractal, where correlations in the density or correlations in magnetization can be described by critical exponents. And it's our goal to figure out ways to measure these exponents in the lab, where there are two challenges. One is from equilibrium StatMech, which is how this whole picture, both of these pictures, have been developed for, but experiments are inherently dynamical. So we need to come up with some way to map out of equilibrium time dynamics back to this like equilibrium picture in order to see critical exponents. The second is that, as I said before, this is a two-dimensional quantum problem that's extremely hard to simulate, but because we do computational science, we can just delete a dimension and then go to 1D. So there are many different protocols that we can study. We focus on a particular one that's non-equilibrium, known as a global quench. We start off by choosing two different types of initial conditions. One is a ground state that is near the critical point here, and the second is a finite temperature state that is also near the critical point. Using either of these two classes, we then quench the system, which is to say we do time evolution under the critical Hamiltonian. And the final step is that we measure local observables in order to determine their critical scaling. So this is the part where there's a lot of data interpretation to figure out how this is related to the phase transitions. Okay, in order to get to this idea of universality, the idea that systems can be described by the phase transition as opposed to like microscopic details, we simulate three different models. The first is transverse field Ising. This is analytically actually exact, one of the few exact models there is in physics based on nearest neighbor interactions. But to make things more general, we add these other two. So the middle one is a three-state model. So this is not a qubit system because there's actually three states on each site. And the last thing is something that looks a lot like Ising, but in addition to nearest neighbor, there's now next nearest neighbor interactions, so it's a little bit more general. In order to compare and contrast universality versus not, it turns out the first and third, the equilibrium transitions are in the same universality class. We expect to see very similar critical scaling. Okay, so based on this, we can now consider the first initial condition, the perturbed ground states. So here I'm varying the distance, like how far away the initial state is from criticality, so that's G. G equals 0 means it's critical. I'm measuring two different types of local observables, so for example, like sigma and epsilon, but just think of them as on-site poly X, poly Z type operators. And lastly, the x-axis here is time, so J is an energy scale. And very qualitatively, we see some sort of exponential decay rate for all of these, which you might expect. When you do a quench, you look at dynamics, things are exponentially decaying. And now all we have to do is figure out how this relates to the quantum phase transition. It turns out that we can use the property that quantum critical points are themselves scale invariant, so there are very few important energy scales in this problem. The main one that we consider is the correlation length of the initial state. So this scales depending on g, the distance from the critical point, as well as nu, a critical exponent. And we can rescale the x-axis by this g to the nu factor and see what happens. So when we do that, we get scaling collapse, which is the fact that all of these different dynamical curves can collapse onto the same scaling function. And using this collapse, we can actually identify the critical exponent that characterizes those transitions. And notably, the first and the third both have nu equals 1, whereas the second model has nu equals 5, 6. So we can actually distinguish and interpret these dynamics, these out of equilibrium dynamics, via the equilibrium transition. So that's one class of initial state. We can consider the second class, which are these finite temperature ensembles. And here's where the project got really confusing and also very computationally intensive. I think probably the longest simulations here took like a month to run on some sort of multi-core node. And there's like thousands of simulations involved in order to get to these data sets. And similarly to how we did a rescaling before, we can now do a rescaling by temperature. And you again see like pretty reasonable scaling collapse across different temperatures and perturbation strengths. The issue here is that the temperature is not actually a property of the quantum phase transition. So that left things like pretty hard to interpret. And it turns out that after getting stuck and doing like Cthulhu level nightmare integrals, we were able to come up with these like analytical models seen in the gray line here. And coming up with this, we were able to basically see in this analytical scaling function how the critical exponents nonetheless still come into play, and coming up with an explanation for all of these different data sets that was like consistent with this analytical model was somewhat satisfying. And that's basically the outlook of this 1D project, where we were able to look at these two classes of experimentally feasible initial states, do non-equilibrium quenches, and relate their universal dynamics back to the underlying quantum phase transition. So that leaves the like here be dragons 2D territory for future work, where probably the first step is to consider methods development for quantum real-time dynamics, a very, very hard problem. And another step would probably be to consider like effective classical models and ways to think about this as experiments become more and more capable of simulating this kind of dynamic. So lastly, I wanted to talk about the practicum that I did at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. If you're considering a place to do a practicum, LVL is a great place. Complete sidebar, there are these like goat herds in the summer, and they're so cute. But okay, back to the practicum. I was mentored by Dr. Chao Yang in the Scalable Solvers group. And I had a really great time. I guess I'm in a physics PhD program, and it was a really great time to be able to chat with people from the applied math backgrounds and kind of get like a very different perspective for what is essentially the same class of problems. And there we worked on a project involving 2D tensor networks, so going from 1D to 2D. And the basic idea here is that a lot of nonlinear optimization, very different from the 1D case, is involved in when you're trying to come up with a compressed representation of two-dimensional states. In particular, we looked at optimization over something known as a disentangler, which is basically used to remove entanglement from these representations. So lastly, I would like to thank my collaborators and my advisor, Norm, who is a CSGF alum from maybe a decade ago, and my Lawrence Berkeley National Lab collaborators, and finally CSGF, who made it possible for me to switch from experiment in undergrad to computation in grad school. Thank you.